So let us start by welcoming Mr. John O'Sullivan. He was a senior advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher back in her administration. He apologized for not being able to be with us today in person. He planned to come yesterday, but we do have him via Zoom today with us. Good afternoon.
Mr. Chairman, members of the diplomatic community, conference attendees, ladies and gentlemen, I feel myself privileged to open this important conference, and I apologize sincerely for not being able to be present in person to do so. I'd like to thank our partners in the IDSF for allowing me to compensate with a brief welcome by Zoom. We're here to address the military, diplomatic, and political lessons that confront us following the invasion of Israel by Hamas on October the 7th last year, and the war crimes against humanity that were intrinsic and calculated elements in it. We are doing so in the capital city of the nation state that was the target, victim of that invasion, and those crimes, and that's at the moment, and we are doing so at a moment of acute military and political crisis for the country. And for that reason, we can't know yet what the final impacts of October the 7th will be, either on Israel or on the international order of which Israel is a full and legitimate part. Yet we can already say that October the 7th and the global reactions to it have shown us that we are living in an international order that is drastically different from the one we thought we were living in less than a year ago. For most of my outlook, historically speaking, since 1945, the modern international order has had three reference points. They come down to quite simple propositions, though the implications are not simple at all. And whatever their flaws and weaknesses, they upheld a legal order that sustained the general peace while quarantining outbreaks of war and terrorism and discouraging their spread. Those things are, first, institutionally speaking, states and agreements between them are the building blocks of global order. The post-war UN system was itself based on nation states, which in turn had been entered legally into international law as early as 1648 in the Treaty of Westphalia. Nation states are the link between organized peoples and global institutions. They lend democratic legitimacy upwards through their membership of global bodies, and they legitimize international agreements downwards through diplomacy, treaties, and international laws. Second, ethically speaking, there has been common agreement, weak but wide, with the idea that diplomacy has moral as well as pragmatic, realist, or even cynical restraints on state action, that some actions violate principles of international order and must be generally condemned. In other words, bad behavior should invite general condemnation and must meet with bad consequences. And although these restraints were inevitably elastic and honored imperfectly, they did create agreed mechanisms in the UN Security Council in particular for resolving disputes, thus for maintaining stability. Those rules were useful for states, including self-styled revolutionary states that otherwise could agree on very little. The third reference point was the political reality of the Cold War. That reinforced stability by dividing the world into two camps in which both Washington and Moscow had clear interest in restraining the actions of their client states in return for granting them overall political support. In those years, the most significant activity of the UN was the Security Council, where the superpowers and their allies negotiated solutions to disputes before they caused more problems for them. The role of the UN General Assembly, as what Conor Cruz O'Brien called a theatre for the psychodrama of Western guilt and third world accusation, was still very much a secondary factor. And the rise of the UN Secretariat as the shaper of a world political agenda on climate, gender ideology, and most else was then scarcely visible. Overall, we can say that this international order achieved one important, great world historical success. that facilitated the peaceful end of the Cold War and the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Empire. But even while the Cold War was winding down, these reference points had begun to decay. And with the rise of Islamism, the economic impact of Arab oil money in Western economies, the migration of third world populations to Europe, and the shifting balance of power between the West and Asia, Israel has now become a focus, the focus, for openly challenging these reference points. The world's reactions to the Hamas attack on October the 7th, with all its deliberate brutalities, has made that horribly and brutally clear. That is evident from the way in which serious international arguments are increasingly framed. Take, for example, my first principle above, that nation states are legitimate as the foundation of international law. Now, the open, declared aim of Hamas, defined in its documents, is to destroy Israel as an independent state with a Jewish core. Israel itself is proclaimed to be illegitimate, an apartheid state in the legalistic jargon. Thus, also the argument goes, whatever is done to retract that illegitimacy must itself be legitimate. That doesn't follow, of course. Just war does not justify war crimes, but the entire subversion of Israeli legitimacy is itself fraudulent. There is not even a plausible claim, let alone evidence, that Israel is an apartheid state. It is nonsense on stilts. In many states that exchange ambassadors with Jerusalem and have long recognized Israel as a UN member now flirt with these thoughts, only or mainly for their own empty purposes of virtue signaling diplomacy in the UN General Assembly and associated UN agencies. It's striking that the USSR, whose successor state is Russia, was the first state to recognize Israel in 1948 and has been an occasional ally. Moscow now effectively sides with Hamasism, apparently on the raw political raison d'etat that enemy of the West should probably be our ally, at least from time to time. The recent advisory decision of the UN's International Court of Justice condemning Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank is a more serious matter. It's dealing with genuinely difficult problems, but those problems result from wars launched against Israel and sporadically continued ever since. That's a complicated matter. But the judgment reads a little like the transcript of a marital argument in a divorce case in which only one spouse has been allowed to speak. It has no enforcement mechanisms unless the UN Security Council decides to vote enforcement. That's unlikely even today. But it can and will become the basis for a stronger international campaign of delegitimizing Israel under the guise of enforcing international law. It's notable the UN's own body of experts have already weaponized the ICJ judgment in even more one-sided and aggressive language than the original document. As a result, the idea that Israel is an a priori illegitimate state has now been absorbed deeply by the Western chattering classes. It has led to a shameful rise in overt antisemitism in Western European countries and in public. And in politics, we now see domestically the determination by Western governments and official bodies, and even the police, not to notice such things as genocidal anti-Israel chanting at Palestinian protests, the kind of thing we've long seen internationally in diplomatic silence over Islamist infiltration of UN agencies in Palestine. We have corruptly financed such agencies for years in lame attempts to buy them off. It didn't work in the Middle East, and it won't work at home. In fact, as we see when we turn to the second reference point, ethics, our thinking on such matters has already been corrupted by our own psychological appeasement. International law incorporates many basic ethical principles, including proportionality, self-defense, rules of war, and so on. If our attachment to those ethical restraints is real, then we should have been permanently outraged by the self-consciously sadistic rapes and murders that Hamas perpetrated on October the 7th. Not just outraged, but determined that Hamas would not benefit them. We benefit from them. We were, for a moment. But Hamas's rejection of any ethical restraints in the genocidal struggle against Israel has proved disturbingly more influential on the West diplomacy than we would have hoped, I think, because it suggests to a weary West that Israel might be more responsive to diplomatic pressure for insurgents than terrorists who favor torture in principle as well as in practice. And the one effect of that, psychological treatment on our part, is that the deaths in Gaza caused by the war between, in which the IDF is attempting to respond to the attacks of Hamas and eventually, if possible, to eliminate it as a force, they are in effect both a cover and a justification for not paying attention to what Hamas did on October 8th, and cover for really treating what's happening in Gaza today as if it's completely unrelated to what happened on October the 7th. The more gruesome and outlandish the behavior, the more Hamas is proud of it. But they also calculate, I think, the more it works. Indeed, the Hamas strategy document leaked to Bill last week shows the degree to which they used their own ill treatment of the hostages to manipulate Western opinion into pressuring their governments, into pressuring Israel to end its legitimate military operations in Gaza. Israel has not yielded to this pressure, I think, right, and I admire the Israeli government for its actions. If it had done otherwise, I think we would have to say it would be betraying, under pressure, it would be betraying the sacrifices IDF soldiers have already made. And unless it does yield to such pressure, I think it will score what would be a decisive liberation of the people of Gaza. But that steadfastness does not at present characterize the wider Western policy, though Ukraine may be an exception to that pessimistic rule. And that gloomy point. Throughout the world, from the South China Sea to the Persian Gulf, to the Iranian building of a nuclear weapon, to the erosion of arms control treaties, the rule of rules is gradually weakening. We know that this general trend is related to the third reference point, the political reality that the bipolar world of the Cold War, after a brief unipolar moment, is being gradually replaced by the multipolar picture of a weakened West, a rising alliance of China, Russia, and Iran, and the shifting allegiances of the BRICS and other powers. More and more countries, unimpressed with the post-war UN order that they had little to say in creating, tend to side cynically with Moscow and Beijing over Western smugness, hypocrisy, their own false memories of colonialism, and their perceptions of current Western decline. In these circumstances, it is all too easy to go along with the Israelis' illegitimate crowd. It costs nothing, and if we're dealing with some of those countries, it may pay well. It's a gloomy picture for Israel, but also for the West in general. As Churchill remarked at the low point of the Second World War, quoting Hamlet, when troubles come, they come not in single spies, but in battalions. But the gloomiest part of it is the West's perception of its own decline. We exaggerate our decline because we now exaggerate our previous strength. We suffered reversals in the Cold War, Suez, Vietnam, Jimmy Carter, and we recovered. And a multipolar world is one in which a united West would still be the most important bloc for a long time, and maybe forever. For that to happen, I should add to the advantages of the West, we shouldn't forget the U.S. economy itself, which is the eighth wonder of the world, even under the management of Biden and Harris. If we are to recover, however, we have first to recover our moral self-confidence and our belief in the cultural and moral virtues of our own civilization. That should cure any tendency towards moral equivalence with Hamas or Russia or China, let alone North Korea. It's not my role here to propose solutions to Israel's and to our difficulties. That's why distinguished speakers are all at the conference. But I will suggest a line of approach. Throughout the West at the moment, there is a divide between the elite and the people. It's a division that must be overcome. Paradoxically, however, in almost all countries, it is the people who retain belief in their own customs, traditions, national histories, national pride, and pride in their civilization. It is the elites who are full of self-contempt and self-hatred. Also, it is the elites who tend to be most confused and sometimes most wrong on the key political issues concerned in the revival of our world, namely immigration, multiculturalism, the defense spending for obvious reasons, and above all, on antisemitism, which very interestingly, again, it is the elites where you are more likely to find antisemitism today, whereas the ordinary people, certainly in Britain, certainly in America, seem, despite the rise in antisemitism, generally to reject it more than anybody else. To succeed in a national revival, a Western revival, any new political movement, therefore, must rely more on training an elite that shares the popular view than on recruiting people to follow the elites of this particular historical moment. Thank you very much.